Okay, we are
Yeah,
recording
it
now.
even it even tells me it's being recorded.
Isn't that a good thing? Because it's
Oh,
like there's
absolutely.
like recording laws and stuff like that. And so it is good
Totally.
that there's a disclosure. So yeah, I recently became aware of this feature and I couldn't believe that I didn't really know about it before, but it is an awesome thing. So we are recording and this is 110 Talk and this is the first 110 chat with Jeff. And Jeff, so we are talking about the new economy today. This is something that you have been developing ideas and content for. This is also something that I have been studying, I think, through my own involvement, through my financial services background and insurance. And I think it's something that's very relevant to this moment in time. I was wondering if we could maybe each just talk a little bit about what is a vision for the new economy. It could be a big vision, like the one that you sort of outlined and what you're doing, or we could drill in on a more specific idea, and then we could kind of see where the conversation takes us. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's great. But it's also, I think, useful to like set a context, like who am I, where have I come from, how did I get here?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, look, I have always looked at you as somebody that was a mentor and a role model because I have known you since before I was born, or you've known me since I was born, and you have this fascinating engineering background, and you've worked with PeopleSoft and Workday, obviously, big part of starting that company. So, do you want to give your own background? You can probably do it better than I can, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said a bit of it there is I like to say I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer. And part of what I did all my career was solve problems. And as you mentioned at Workday, we were building a cloud company before there was a cloud, and we knew we were going to have to solve problems that nobody had solved before. And
Hmm.
so part of that for me was we needed to look at the foundation or the assumptions that we were going to need to make and what we were expecting for us to do as a company, what our customers could do as part of the software we were building. And so when I retired from that, I kind of took that approach and I started looking at economics or financial systems after the '08, '09 financial crisis.
Hmm.
And so it took me down this path of, well, what are the assumptions on which our economy is built?
Absolutely. That is very, very important content. Thank you for putting it that way. So now that we've put it into context, then as we think about the new economy, I was thinking maybe we could discuss the engineering specific industry because one of the things that really resonated from what you and I have connected on before the topics is about making things obsolete. There's a really
Hmm.
beautiful quote that we connected on that said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So I was thinking maybe we could take that into engineering specifically because of the things you talked about. My pops and my sister also worked in engineering, and it's very fascinating to me. But I wanted to just share one idea that I had as somebody who has not been in the same systems that you have necessarily building clouds like you talked about with Workday and all the engineering experience. But I wanted to share one idea that I had as I was jotting down notes for this conversation. And then I was thinking maybe we could take it to how do we talk about this as it relates to the engineering field. But the one thing that I had an idea on is about this idea of alternative currencies, cryptocurrencies, and having employees be more empowered through some flattening of some hierarchy structures and possibly receiving equity in their company, no matter what level of the company they're in. So maybe it's a traditional share, maybe it's a form of alternative or cryptocurrency. But in that vein of making systems obsolete, maybe as it relates to engineering, like we're going to go into next, my sort of first thought as I'm thinking about the new economy is why don't we make it normal for employer, not required, but something that's normal for employers of any employee at any level to have some ownership in the company so that they are more involved and they're more vested in the outcome of the company overall. And so if you have any comments on that, feel free. I am not an expert. I just provoke conversation, but I wanted to dig into that topic as it relates to engineering and sort of these structures that we can evolve over time.
Yeah, I mean, you covered a really broad landscape there,
I
and I
know.
think it's important to kind of like drill down into what's the foundation. Right? So, as an engineer, you build something, whether it's a physical structure like a house or a bridge or a piece of software. There's always a foundation, and I like to think of it as what are the assumptions that we're making.
Mhm.
And in our current economic model, it's built on a system of capital. We call it money, and it can take the form of US dollars or euros. But now we're seeing cryptocurrencies. And when you prioritize currency, the system will go into orbit around that. And the structures that emerge out of our needs for various human capacities for food, shelter, technology, whatever, will be driven by that. And I think that's part of the problem we've got to. And you talk a little bit about giving people equity in whatever they're building, and I think that's an essential thing. But
Mhm.
I think the deeper thing is why is capital the driving force to the point where things that we do that actually have deep social impact, feeding people, dealing with unhoused, healthcare, they're not really designed to generate profit, and so the capitalist system diminishes them. And so when I talk about an economy, I say, well, what would a needs-based economy where we meet human needs first? And when we build on that foundation, we then start to look at what are some of the social structures that we would build, and how would money, or as I like to say, currencies, work in that system, and what is it that
Mhm.
we really value.
Do you believe that the two can exist together, the capitalist economy and the needs-based systems that we're building, integrating into the economy? Do you believe that they can exist in harmony and don't have to just replace each other? They can both exist together?
I don't know. Here's what my gut says is no. Because whenever you have a system that is self-serving, so for example, in a capital system where I can make money with my money, it's going to just naturally attract that attention and the energy that people are putting out in the world.
Hmm.
And so I think it would be very difficult. And frankly, right now, if we don't start addressing basic needs, then the rest of it doesn't matter,
But
right?
isn't the, go ahead.
If people aren't able to find work that earns enough income to pay for their housing and pay for their food, and look at the spiraling costs of healthcare, and with the technology of artificial intelligence, it's just making more and more jobs obsolete. And so we have to begin to question, how are people actually going to earn an income that's going to pay for the things that meet their basic needs?
Isn't there, with this idea of alternative currency that you and I have both really respected and thought about and considered how we could implement into the economy, isn't this idea of alternative currency? So it does not replace the currency, but it does provide rewards and a currency for things that matter into this society. If that was something that could be built, would that be something that could coexist with capitalism, where you still have all of these needs for profit, but then you also, in some cases, have these partnered businesses and communities where you can do things that are good for the community, such as feeding the homeless, or such as planting trees, or cleaning up a road. And that those things would therefore be a currency that could be redeemable somewhere. So, in the sense of still having the dollar, still having all the currencies, but also building communities and partnerships to develop this alternative currency that is not designed to replace the currency. Could that work? Because if they cannot coexist together at all, then in my mind, there's no way to make it obsolete. So I think we have to find a way. I'm wondering if we could build this sort of alternative currency through networks.
Well, I think yes and no, right? If profit becomes a incentive, then in economics there's something called perverse incentives. That they're things that, when you think about it, do we really want to incentivize somebody to do that?
Sorry, Jeff,
And
what was it called? Reversing incentives? It broke up a little bit for me.
perverse incentives, like
Okay.
negative incentives,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, okay.
And perverse.
Reverse.
And so when you think about it, if my what's driving my business is producing profit or surplus, right?
Yes.
Then things that cost me, like treating the wastewater that I put into the environment,
Hmm.
will get diminished, ignored, or avoided at all costs. Or, as you mentioned earlier, the idea of, well, I want my product, I need to keep my sales going. So I'm going to make my product have a finite life. And so, where it might cost me a few dollars to put a part into something so that it lasts longer, by not doing that, I save the cost of the part, but I also create a system where what you're building is going to break or wear out
Hmm.
prematurely, and
Hmm.
you have to buy another one, right? Just look what's happening with cell phones. There's, oh, every year there's a
Every
new
year. Yeah.
iPhone that comes out,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And so, is it
And we all want to
really
get
that
it.
much
We all want
different?
to get it because they do have better features, you know? It's like, yeah, definitely.
Right? So these are perverse incentives, and so as long as there's an incentive and a focus on generating profit, I think it's going to be very difficult to, prevent that. I think we can say government has done a horrible job at, trying to regulate or deal with businesses that are having adverse effects. And in fact, many businesses, their business model is, well, we will break the law until we get caught, and they build into the cost of doing business, any fines or penalties or consequences of it. So, it's a really dysfunctional system.
Hmm.
And so now, back into the idea of currencies or money, most of what doesn't happen in existing currencies is looking at a full cycle, right? Which is, currency gets created currently by the government, or in the case of Bitcoin, by the ecosystem. And nobody's really addressing, and how does the money get retired? How does it get pulled out of the system? So I was listening to a podcast this morning, and the U.S. debt is $34 trillion.
Mm.
And so, how does that, and we keep putting more and more currency or money into the system, which creates inflation, and we're not pulling it out, right? We're not retiring it. And so there are some things in our current financial model which are deeply coupled to capitalism, that we have to address. And this is some of the things that I work on and talk to about the people I work with.
This is very important. And we're not going to solve anything today here on this show. We are just having the conversation. This is food for thought. These are conversations that we can take into our communities, the people that we talk with. I know you talk to a lot of people through your work. I listen to the bill conference that you had sent me. And so this is an ongoing conversation. This is food for thought. This is ideas for generation. And I think that you do mention something that's very important in terms of the government and how our systems are setting us up for this in a way. And I wanted to pivot a little bit because we did discuss homeless, feeding the homeless, and I wanted to discuss homeless shelters for a minute
Hmm.
because there is a new legislation that is being created in Congress. It's called the Road to Housing Act in Congress. And I've been thinking about how do everyday citizens like you and me, how do we get our ideas like this to Congress people effectively, whether it be in regards to the Homeless Act or even if it is about our ideas for making a more sustainable system for the economy. And I wanted to give a real life example. So I'm actually staying in Southern California right now in Torrance, and the place that I'm staying is a hotel right now, but they are possibly converting it into a homeless shelter. I actually think it is a beautiful idea that they do so. But just as soon as I got here, there were these news articles, there were these news vans out front talking about a stalling of this deal going through. It appears that they had set aside this building for homeless housing. And then what happened is the city leaders across the street, they said, oh, wait, we just got an independent proposal. I'm sorry, an independent appraisal saying that the value of the building is less than the nonprofit was offering us. And so we're going to hold up this deal right now, and it's at standstill. And I think this is a beautiful example of something that could become a homeless shelter that I think we should not call a homeless shelter. I think we should call it a launching pad for people to get back in their feet, be empowered. But I wanted to sort of bring up this homeless issue because there both is a real life example that I'm living through right now. I'm kind of in the center of it just based on what's going on in the news. And also because there are very real legislations that are being considered in our Congress. And so I was thinking, how do we communicate with these government leaders about moving legislation, homeless shelters, evolving things from that vein of being in the nonprofit space?
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot to unpack there.
I know,
Um,
I know.
in our current kind of governance ecosystem, it's very difficult to get anything done at any level. Now you're talking about the local level, where I think actually things can happen, but what you just experienced there was where capitalism inserted itself, where it said, well, what's the value of this piece of property? and it goes to the marketplace and creates some assessment of its value. But nobody's asking what's the value of having people housed, and
Right.
how do you measure that? You
Right.
can't measure that in dollars. And
Right.
so here we have this inherent conflict. And frankly, the mainstream, the politicians, the banking system, they're still looking through that old lens. And I think the deeper question is, how do we provide a shift in mindset? How do we start to do that? That's some of the work that I focus on. And in fact, you even used the word, we called you called it a non-profit.
Hmm.
So right there, we have implicit in our language that, well, this isn't profitable. But who said profit should be our ultimate goal? Right? That's the capitalistic model. That's the financial system that is self-serving and continues to, expand its influence and, generate more money for people that already have money. And so there's this disparity that's happening. And I think it's something that not a lot of people are talking about. It's being talked about in fringes, but the solutions that I've seen really don't address that root, that foundation of it's all built on this idea of profit.
Absolutely. That is the inherent conflict in our system right now. And I just keep going back to that quote about you don't fight the existing reality. We have to work with it. And so there are definitely a lot of problems. But my mind always goes back to what can we do on the ground? Like,
Absolutely.
how can we
Paul.
locally get involved with talking to our Congress people, presenting ideas, having conversations, building communities, like which I think is very well thread through art and also education. You talked about this in your Nashville discussion, and it's about
Mm.
education. I'm thinking about how do we get kids or even adults like me or even you, it doesn't matter how old we are. How do we get everybody contributing ideas through education systems and feedback loops and getting it back to the people in the government who are making decisions about how this is going to be structured? Um, how do we think about nonprofits these days, right? Because a nonprofit is still a business. It's still a business. It's still got to pay its overhead and its expenses, pay all of its employees, and do the work that it does. How do we have partnerships between these nonprofits? So it's not a competition, it is more in alignment with each other's missions and supporting each other. So these are the kinds of things that we think of as we have this bigger problem of what is the
Yeah,
conflict. It's like those are
yeah,
the things that I'm thinking about in terms of being on the ground, talking with people and community.
yeah, yeah. I think first I like to just work with language. So let's get away from calling them nonprofits and call them social impact businesses, right?
Mm,
Because they have a real social impact in our society. And this is where we have to look in the mirror and what kind of culture do we want to create in terms of equality and opportunity. And your quote, you don't change reality. You don't change by reality by fighting the existing reality. You make change by creating something new that makes the old obsolete. And,
hmm.
and I think it starts at a grassroots level,
Hmm.
right? Top down change is extremely difficult
Right.
because there's so many layers it has to percolate down. If you talk about the federal and down to potentially state level, and maybe county, and then city, and so the work that I've been doing is focused in something called a concept called bioregionalism, where how do we treat a a physical area, and it could be defined by city limits, it could be defined by a watershed. There's lots of different ways, and focus change there.
Mm,
And And that's part of what I've been doing. And then it is about starting to shift this mindset. And, you know, there's a lot of pieces that have to fall in place. And I think as I approach the problem, I want to focus on building that grassroots system. So if things start to collapse at the higher level, that there's something that it lands on, that we don't crash down into a pile of rubble, right? And so interesting when you think about it. Again, I love using engineering metaphors. You know, trying to replace the foundation of the house, right, while it's already been built. And yes, you can do it. You know, you see older homes that get jacked up, and a
Yeah.
new foundation gets built.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a both and so um, what are the new kinds of focus that we need to? And I think part of it is, how do we start to pull capital out of the old system and put it into these new systems? And then again, design, and you mentioned it, you know, a flow of value that aligns with, you know, quality food that's at affordable prices,
Mm,
housing that's not driven
mm,
by some profit motive. When you look at the cost of buying or renting a home, or someplace to live, the majority of that cost is in debt, in
mhm.
someone having a mortgage on it.
Yep.
And there's no real value in that when you actually look at the cost of operating, you know, a home, or an apartment building. It actually drops down pretty low, because it's maintenance costs and, you know, utility costs, and things like that. And so again, these are all things that we need to rethink and, you know, figure out how to transition. I work with some folks that they are pulling real estate out of the speculative market and putting it into a new kind of ecosystem that's not extractive, right? So either debt free or very low interest. So the interest is to service the loan, not to generate profit for somebody who had the capital.
I love that. I love that. And see, these are the things that matter, right? These very tangible experiences, because we can't just go to the top and be like, okay, we're gonna make these changes in the government. We have to lead through example at the grassroots level, like you said, with bioregionalism, whether it be an area or a certain type of loan, like you just provided. On my side, let's say we get homeless example that we don't call homeless, we call it a launching center. I feel very strongly about that. Or like for
Yep.
example, with my website that I have, I am in the early stages of building a community site, not designed to compete with any social media platform or anything like that, but to actually build a community. So in my mind, it's like, you know, what you're doing with this, with these local areas and with these different types of loans with the people you know, that could be a use case. What I'm doing, whether it be some type of launching center or community site, that can be a test case. And we can start to build these examples that people can then follow and maybe replicate in other communities. Because even if we had all the resources in the world, we can't do each of these things ourselves. We want to be able to clear a path for others to do the same thing. And I think that as we start to build those examples and as we start to build those communities, that is how it can kind of organically create change, and then it can come more from the ground level instead of from the top down type of economics and politics. That's just something that comes into my mind that I think we can agree on right now, because it's like we cannot solve all these issues right now. But I think having the conversation and being leaders in the communities that we step into and that we build, that is how we can affect change for the long term that kind of flows up instead of down.
You're absolutely right. And you know what you described, I think of it as transitional housing, right? Where people are in transition in their life, and How do you create a place where they can make that transition? And and it is a grassroots thing. And I loved you used the word replication, right? There's a part of this for me. It's a social experiment. And when I would write code, it's like I part of what I had to do was debug it. Oh, that didn't work the way I wanted it to. So what do I need to fix? And I think the same thing exists in the social structures is who's doing it well, what's working, what's not working, how do we adjust that? And a big piece of it is that mindset, right? So if someone was willing to buy that building that's not at some market price, which is just set arbitrarily, right? And
Hmm.
here's the case. It's often driven by debt that has to be paid off that was incurred on that, or
Right.
everybody that wants to take their little piece of whatever we're selling and its value. And so it's the extractive aspect of capitalism. There's always somebody that wants their piece and is trying to argue that what they contributed is has some value, aka pay me for it.
That is very well said. There's a lot of things we discussed today that I had not thought about before, about the debt as well and how much of a role that plays because we do tend to have so much debt. I'll just give a simple example just to bring it back to the ground level. I always have to do that is like when I went to get a trailer that I was staying in for a while, I was prepared to pay for it in cash. I was blessed to have enough cash to be able to do that. It was not a big fancy trailer. It was something that I could afford. And I go in to buy it, and I am basically convinced with a lot of pressure to not even pay for it in cash. It is about incurring the debt. They wanted me to incur the debt. They wanted me to finance it. And I understand that because I've worked in finance for a while
Hmm.
and I understand commission incentives and all of that. But it's like when I went to go get it, they didn't want my cash. They wanted me to finance as much of it as humanly possible. And it's just one simple example that kind of brings me back to the ground level of where I'm at, where we're at, and how we operate in the world. And so I think we've touched on so many great topics today. And I want to encourage anybody that listens to this conversation to feel free to engage with us and tell us what your ideas are, what your thoughts are. You don't have to agree with our mindsets or our perspectives, but I think this is an important conversation because this is the world that we all live in right now, and we are all part of the solution. So we would love to know your ideas. And Jeff, I would say I love that we talked about possibly doing a series. So, like, let's do a conversation. Let's focus in on a few topics. I think we've done that today. I would say maybe we could have another conversation in due time about another conversation topic, either as it relates to this or maybe something that has evolved either out of what we've discussed or maybe somebody that comes in and comments or asks a question or has another idea. Maybe we can kind of let this sort of sprout as a seed and maybe we could pick up and have another conversation at a future point in time. How do you feel about that?
I love that, Paul, and I love that you're inviting people to, ask questions because I think that's really foundational. And,
Right,
and I think, when I talked about shifting mindset, some of that is about asking questions about what, hopefully people in hearing our conversation will get exposed to some things. Oh, I didn't think of it that way as
right,
you did when I talked about servicing loans. And
right,
so that's the place where we have to start to come from. And absolutely, whether we carry this conversation a little bit deeper or somebody, a listener asks a deeper question, yeah, let's do that.
yeah,
Again, it's part of what I want to do to start to get some of these ideas out there. Because as you said, no one person is going to do this alone,
right,
right? We're
right.
all in this together. And so, how do we work together? How do we engage? In fact, I was thinking about this at breakfast this morning. How do we work with what I call next economy businesses, or how do we work for a next economy business, or how do we create a next economy business? I think those are three different places at which people can engage.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up this conversation for the 110 chat, is there anything you would like to share with anybody who is listening about the content that you're putting out, your business, anything like that that's helpful for the for research and for engagement? Or we could always pick that up in our next conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we can pick up in a future conversation.
Okay.
I think, when you and I first started having this conversation, I recommended a book that you reached back out and before we started this. And what was the name of that book? And I would encourage people. It's called New Money for a New World, and it's a great place. It's where I started in that '08, '09 time frame, and it took me on this incredible journey. And I think for people that want to see a different way an economy could work, that book has some great examples.
I've read that book. I co-sign on what you just said. That book inspired me and it resonated for over a decade because I've read it over a decade and I always think back to it. I will link to that book in the show notes of the podcast, and however we put out this talk show. And with that being said, I think this was a wonderful conversation. I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I have some things that I'm working on, and maybe we can talk about it next time. But for now, let's let this conversation breathe and absorb and see where it goes next. And Jeff, I really look forward to connecting with you again, whether it be for this forum or just individually. And thank you so much for being with me, having this chat with me today. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Absolutely, Paul. I love our conversations, and like you said, I've known you all your life, and watching you grow and develop as a young man, and what you're working on. Absolutely, I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Perfect, man. Thank you so much. Talk soon.
Okay, bye.